This is one of the many art installations that were inspired by yellow wallpaper. This one down here says from 1990. It was done by Marlene and Jeja, and so that's one view of it. Okay, zoomed in, we have the actual story, the text of the yellow wallpaper written on the wall, as though that's the thing that's being dug through or is coming out. And then here we get a person, right, playing the role of Jane in the crawling around the room, that smooch mark on the lower part of the wall. And actually, if you look at the wallpaper and art installations, you're going to find a lot of them. It's inspired quite a few. I just like this in terms of thinking about like what was it that room might have looked like. And again, this is just like one small piece of it, but it's just something to think about and visualize. So in yellow wallpaper is a specific, I don't want to say it's special in any way, but it's a specific type of text where the narrator is extremely important in understanding that our narrator is not the traditional narrator that we get or expect in most readings. And then the other piece is that the reveal that happens at the end of the story changes the entire story. So back in, it was early 2000s, back when Oprah Winfrey had the Oprah show. She did a book a month club, and she had Toni Morrison, did several Toni Morrison novels, and she had Toni Morrison on for one of those novels discussing it. And she told Morrison that, she was reading the book and she got to this like one part and she had to go back 100 pages and reread all these other parts. And she was just talking about how challenging it was and going on. And Morrison is sitting there with a smirk on her face, and her response is, that's what we call reading. And yellow wallpaper is similar to that. Once you get the reveal at the end, if we return and read it over, the entire story changes. And so, right, like here, I have my note, who is Jane? And so Jane is our narrator, but Jane is also not our narrator. So it's one of those more complicated things. And that was one of the claims that our groups had, the idea that there was multiple Janes, right? The short story features 2 Janes. And this is something that's important for all of the texts we're reading this semester, is that I don't want to say we have untrustworthy narrators in all of them, but there's like a question about who's narrating each of the texts we're reading and from what perspective and what it is we get from that. And so we're going to see that with Zong and Zoot Suit as well with our notes of play there. You'll see when we get there. There's different sort of voices that are coming through, and you're not really sure what's happening or who to read. And then finally, with our novels, the majority of them have multiple narrators, and the story kind of changes and looks slightly different depending on whose eyes it's being told through. And so, in thinking about and looking at the discussion board and your guys' responses to one another, all these pieces, you could put them together in one essay, right? And it would have this like very complex argument, and you have a lot to back it up. And so with your evidence, there was some overlapping evidence, but also people in the same with the same claim were bringing in different pieces. So there was very much a lot to work with showing up. Going back to mine for a minute, I just wanted to highlight a couple things when I was making my notes on this. This is actually something that's been read and annotated multiple times. I did not put all these notes in like the first read, but it had to do with reading for different purposes each time. So for instance, when I have like the J over here, I was reading specifically to see when John was discussed, and I know on our discussion board there were a lot of questions about him, like what kind of husband he was. But again, thinking back to the perspective, and what if our narrator is an unreliable narrator? And that's like something to keep in mind. Why is it that we should trust her? Thinking about all the gaps, and even gaps that are acknowledged, right? So we write like we get this time frame. So I didn't want to move here, and we did move here. We've been here for 2 weeks, and then we get every time there's a dot dot dot, a significant amount of time has passed before she's writing it again. And additionally, right, once we get to that end and we get that reveal that our narrator is Jane, but our narrator is also not Jane, then we're trying to figure out, if you go back and read again, that perspective. And so Jane the narrator versus Jane the character. We don't actually know much about Jane the character, right? We only get that narrator's perspective, and our narrator is sort of like the madness, or right when Jane is struggling with postpartum depression, she's having this like psychological event, and our narrator is the one trying to break out of the wallpaper essentially and trying to take over Jane, right? And so these moments that we see her surface, and we get like this description of all the damage done throughout the room, which again, one of our groups was like, the claim was, what if those like little boys didn't do the damage, right? What if Jane did it? And so there's all these gaps that we don't get filled for us. And so whenever we have that in a story, we have to like wonder about our narrator and what is happening there. Another approach when reading this, I have like all of these squares. These are all the moments where she's talking about the wallpaper and looking at it and trying to understand it. And this, using the yellow wallpaper to think about close reading, we get an example of like close reading happening, except the thing that our narrator is close reading, it is the wallpaper, right? She's doing those multiple layers of questions and is trying to understand and figure out like, what is this wallpaper? She's going to get to the bottom of this. She's going to discover the secret. She doesn't want anyone else getting there before her. She's very motivated by that and trying to understand it. So in terms of thinking about, again, the idea of like getting very meta, close reading, like we're seeing close reading happen here as we're doing our own close reading of the text and putting those pieces together. And, right, there's other things. Was it Cameron who was talking about the significance of yellow? So there's a lot of that we could have done throughout this piece. I didn't do much of it. I mean, one of the things that I noted here was the idea of the moon. And this goes again about like masculine, feminine thing. The moon's feminine, the sun is masculine. Like, what does the moon do? The moon reflects the light from the sun. So like femininity reflecting masculinity, blah, 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 right? Like you take her using the moon and nighttime as being that moment for her to like conduct her business and like do a lot with that as far as like development. And so one of the purposes of this and our discussion board, go back to it, is again thinking about all those different critical approaches that we're going to be encountering across the semester, and the idea that depending on our intentions for reading something, that's going to determine our experience reading it and what we get out of it, right? And so it's not just these different approaches, but like, let's say you have a really great day and you sit down to read something, you're going to experience that text very differently than if you had like a really terrible day and you sit down to read it, because sort of like everything with your experience and in your head and in your mind at that time, you're going to be seeing the text interact with it somehow. And so when we have these specific approaches, like the feminist approach or the psychoanalytic approach, and we've been reading about all those terms and things like that, we're going to be like looking for them and more sensitive to those moments where they show up and noticing them a lot more. And then any text you take, right, you put down like or if you just focus on the feminist approach, you see all these really specific things that are connected to that. And then you read it again with the psychoanalytic approach, you see things that are connected to that. You can read it again with another approach and see things, right? So it's various lenses, and that changes our experience with the text, what we do with it, how we write about it, those questions we ask it for close reading, and taking that further and further steps trying to make that knowledge. So this is just our first thing to get started on that. And like I said, with our themes was historical. She did have, she didn't have this experience, it's a piece of fiction, but she did have postpartum depression and was institutionalized, and she had to like fight her family, her husband, her brother, right? Like those pieces were real for her life. And it was a very common experience in the 19th century. So it's unfortunate, but it did happen. And postpartum depression, again, one of our claims here, even until very recently, it was something that was ignored and denied, that women did not have this. So it wasn't just the 19th century, it was well into the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, before it was taken seriously. So seeing her perspective and trying to process this, what happens when women were treated that way and what are possible outcomes, and playing with those like Gothic style of writing that is a version of